Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Patricia Anderson and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'll be your producer today, and we're pleased to welcome you to the PSG Consulting First Monday webinar, which just in case you're wondering, we all know this is not the first Monday in June. We are switching up the schedule a little bit for the summertime. And we thank you for joining us. I want to encourage you to engage with our panelists throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature. It looks like a couple of talk bubbles at the bottom of your screen. And once again, thanks for joining us. And I'm pleased to turn it over to our host, Paige Gardner.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks everyone for joining us. Today's topic is focused on a pretty fundamental question. How and when does public policy impact voter attitudes and behaviors? In fact, when do major pieces of social policy that lead to some fundamental changes reach public awareness? One way of asking the question is, are the legislative battles all sound and fury, signifying nothing? Setting the perceptions of the goals and outcomes of public policy seems to be the true fight for many. The narrative in voters' minds may fly in the face of the actual intent or impact of enacted legislation. Our first speaker, Daniel Hopkins, is a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, where he studies American voting behavior, public opinion, race, and state and local politics. He has written an important book on today's topic, Stable Conditions, Elites, Limited Influence on America's Healthcare Attitudes. This book raises fascinating issues around the ability of elected officials to move public opinion and garner public support through policymaking. By the way, we are putting a link in the chat for those who want to purchase his book and read it. Our next speaker, Dr. Anna Greenberg, has over 20 years experience polling in the political, nonprofit, and academic sectors. She's an expert on voter attitudes and behavior. She's an experienced strategist for candidates and campaigns at all levels. Her perspectives on the cycle-to-cycle role of public policies and the impact of significant legislative accomplishments on voter behavior will add additional insights to this conversation. So let's begin the discussion with a question. What matters and who cares about legislative accomplishments in an increasingly polarized operating environment? Dan, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Paige. Thanks also to Patricia and to Sarah for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to join you folks and to talk about the book that I just published this spring. The book is called Stable Condition, Elites' Limited Influence on Healthcare Attitudes. The Affordable Care Act, as will be no surprise to many of the people on this webinar, and I will, by the way, try to speak somewhat slowly since I listen to all my podcasts at 1.5 speed. I'm used to thinking that professional exchanges happen at a very, very fast clip, and I will try to remind myself to slow down. But the Affordable Care Act is, as we all know, has been a central political battleground. Arguably, it was the hot core at the center of American political contestation from at least 2009 through 2020, and is still influencing our politics in a variety of ways today. One of the key questions is, were political leaders able to demonstrably shift public opinion on this highly polarized issue? Now, political leaders surely tried to do so. They tried to move public opinion, whether, for the Affordable Care Act or on the Republican side, away from the Affordable Care Act. And they did so chiefly using two different levers. One of those levers was the Affordable Care Act itself, with Democrats trying to bolster the law so that it would have positive impacts on people's lives. And on the flip side, Republicans often trying to weaken the law so as to dampen its impacts and prevent it from becoming ensconced in American public policy. And at the same time, we also saw that leaders worked hard to change public opinion by their use of messaging, whether it was death panels or a variety of other rhetorical devices whose goal was to build or detract from the support for the Affordable Care Act. The question is, what was the impact of all of those efforts? And I'm going to argue that largely the answer to this question is no. That is to say, political leaders, by and large, were not able to shift public opinion, with one important exception, on this highly polarized, highly salient, highly contentious issue. And partly that's because the impacts of actually receiving insurance through the Affordable Care Act were surprisingly limited. They were cross-cutting. So some people benefited from the Affordable Care Act and their attitudes towards it improved, while other people were hurt by the Affordable Care Act, whether it was the individual mandate or other aspects of the law. And the positive impacts that we will see on some Americans' attitudes were undercut by the relatively low voter turnout among key groups of beneficiaries. We'll also see that the impacts of messaging were limited and were quite ephemeral. So there were occasionally brief impacts of the different kinds of messages that either Republicans or Democrats deployed in trying to persuade Americans about the merits and the downsides of the Affordable Care Act, but many of those impacts were quite limited. What you wind up with then is an image of public opinion as quite stable, hence the title of the book. And to the extent that public opinion does move, it moves primarily in response to threats to the status quo. The Affordable Care Act initially was, one of its challenges was that it was changing the status quo, giving rise to a whole set of arguments and concerns that the Affordable Care Act would disrupt existing health insurance coverage. But then once the Republicans had unified control of the federal government starting in January of 2017, their moves to repeal the Affordable Care Act shifted what the status quo was. And the Affordable Care Act by that time had become the status quo itself and could then benefit from the same status quo biases that had made it hard to generate support for the ACA earlier in its existence. So for many people on this webinar, it's no surprise that the Affordable Care Act was high drama, right? The politics of the ACA had many really decisive moments where those of us following it closely were genuinely unsure of what was likely to happen. There were a variety of moments when the ACA's fate hung in the balance. So for instance, you may remember in December of 2009, then Nebraska Senator Ben Nelson negotiating with Harry Reid over whether he would support the bill and what would be required for him to do so. You may then remember that in January 2010, Scott Brown was elected to the US Senate, depriving the Democrats of the 60-vote supermajority that they needed to pass legislation not through the budget process. And Barack Obama then chose to continue to pursue the Affordable Care Act in the face of the increasing political headwinds. You may also remember in March, when the House of Representatives worked to pass the exact same language that the US Senate had passed, Representative Bart Stupak of Michigan, a Democrat who was concerned about the impact on abortion, then was negotiating about whether he would vote for the Affordable Care Act as it existed, given its abortion language. But even after passage, there were a variety of moments when single individuals could have tanked or really changed the fate of the Affordable Care Act. You'll remember that John Roberts voting to uphold, by and large, the Affordable Care Act in June 2012 was one of those key moments when the decision of a single individual could have tipped the history of the ACA and so the health insurance of millions of Americans in another direction. But even then, in July of 2017, when 3 Senate Republicans voted no on a skinny repeal effort that would likely have led to some significant repeal of key elements of the Affordable Care Act. And this image here is the famous moment when John McCain, I think sometime right around midnight in July of 2017, voted no, sealing the fate of that particular effort at repealing the Affordable Care Act. So this was at the elite level, at the level of politicians and journalists, this was about as dramatic as American politics can get. And yet, at the level of public opinion, views look much, much closer to a flat line. So what we have here, courtesy of the incredible data that has been collected by the Kaiser Family Foundation over more than a decade, we can just see average favorability and unfavorability toward the Affordable Care Act. And the short story is that the Affordable Care Act has generally produced relatively stable opinions, that we can see that those who are unfavorable towards the Affordable Care Act rose a bit in the 2013-2014 period. And that in and of itself is quite a paradox because January 1st, 2014 was the official implementation date of key provisions in the Affordable Care Act, meaning that for the first time right around then, many Americans were feeling the impacts of the ACA on their lives. So puzzling through why the law, when it was implemented, became less popular is an important part of this broader book project. And then you can see that slowly the law became more popular with a bit of a discontinuity right around 2017 when the Republicans control both houses of Congress as well as the presidency and are actually able to pursue their goal of repeal. So one question then is, well, were the changes that we observed driven by people's direct experiences with the Affordable Care Act? Now, the Affordable Care Act is a complex law. I think that's partly the explanation for why it didn't leave more of an imprint on public opinion. But one of the key pillars of the Affordable Care Act was the expansion of Medicaid that was then modified by the Supreme Court, but has now been implemented in more than 40 US states. So one thing we can do then is we can look at the attitudes towards the Affordable Care Act, both before and after the expansion took place, in states that are going to expand and states that did not expand, at least in the period that I'm looking at. And I have a whole set of statistical analyses which can buttress the conclusions that I'm offering. The short answer, and you can see it here in this figure to some degree, is that Americans who had low incomes and lived in expansion states did become somewhat more favorable, on the order of a few percentage points, more favorable towards the Affordable Care Act once the expansion was implemented. That was an effect that was limited to low-income Americans in states that had expanded. So was there some impact of direct experience with the expansion? Yes, but it was limited. It was limited both in that its effect size was relatively small. It was also limited in that not every state expanded, and indeed key states either expanded later or still have not expanded, right? Medicaid expansion still has not come to states including Florida and Texas. But it was also limited by other factors. And it's important to keep in mind that, as a variety of American politicians have said with more colorful language than I'll use, insurance is a big deal, right? In health insurance, the provision of health insurance, the protections that it affords, particularly for families that are eligible for Medicaid, can often be valued at something to the effect of $5,000. And that's just an average value. If you're a family with significant health needs, its real value to you could be significantly in excess of that. So why did such a large financial value not have more of a political impact? There are a variety of reasons. Partly, the numbers of people affected are relatively small. So in expansion states, you see the number of Americans who rely on Medicaid shifting in the single digits, maybe gets up to 10% in some states, but we're still talking about relatively small numbers of people. These are groups of people, lower income people, whose turnout rates are often lower. So for example, a Kaiser Family Foundation in Kentucky in the 2015 governor's race found that Medicaid recipients reported turning out about 20% of the time, whereas all the other folks that they surveyed reported turning out in that gubernatorial election about 50% of the time. So any attitudinal impacts in this population are going to be dampened by relatively low rates of voter turnout. And as I mentioned, not all states expanded, particularly not initially. So there were a variety of factors that led the Medicaid expansion to not lead to a sea change in public opinion overall. Well, the Medicaid expansion was only one part of the Affordable Care Act, though. You might ask, well, what about the exchanges? Now, the exchanges were targeted to people with higher incomes than was the Medicaid expansion. And politically, the exchanges were a key element in potentially building a more middle-class constituency for the Affordable Care Act and for increased government intervention in health insurance markets. So what about the exchanges? Now, if you're a family that is making more than, let's say we're talking about a family that makes 150% of the federal poverty line, so ineligible for Medicaid, but still eligible for substantial subsidies to their health insurance if they purchase that insurance through the exchanges. What we can see here is that when the exchanges opened in 2014, on the left-hand side, you can see that people who were on Medicaid or Medicare or had employer-provided insurance, their attitudes didn't change that much, right? On the right-hand side, though, we can see people who purchased their own insurance around the time of the exchange's opening do become markedly more favorable towards the Affordable Care Act. But there's an offsetting shift in that people who lacked insurance, who used to be more favorable towards the Affordable Care Act before it, suddenly become less favorable. What's happening here? Partly, the composition of these groups are changing. And partly, it's also worth keeping in mind that if you are uninsured after the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, then that is a choice. But it is a choice that came for a few years with a fine that could be a significant share of your income. And so we see some significant amount of political selection right around this period of time. The net impact, though, of opening the exchanges was really dampened by the mandate. It was dampened by the fact that millions of Americans whose insurance was not up to the ACA's standards lost that insurance in late 2013. And of course, there was also the disastrous rollout of the ACA website. All of these factors then combined to dampen the impact of the exchanges. And the exchanges, too, don't directly provide government insurance, right? They are subsidies that help people purchase private insurance, but they're designed in a way so as to keep the government's direct role in the background. And that, too, that complexity, so many of the challenges in dealing with the exchanges, the tremendous differences in the quality of insurance across states that was available on the exchanges, all of these factors together really worked to limit the impacts of the exchanges. Now, what about messaging? Folks may remember that Sarah Palin had very memorably in the summer of 2009 referred to the Affordable Care Act as bringing death panels into American healthcare. So what you can see in these figures are clusters of open-ended responses where we asked, and Kaiser, Pew, other pollsters asked Americans why they were favorable or unfavorable towards the Affordable Care Act. And I really like these open-ended questions because they let us see they're a more sensitive measure of how Americans are thinking. And if there's any survey question that should show us, should return the impacts of political rhetoric, it might well be these open-ended questions. So it's really instructive that in the two surveys immediately after Sarah Palin's use of death panels, there was one respondent in one of those two surveys that used the phrase. So that rhetoric, even though it captivated particularly many on the left, that rhetoric did not actually show up in much public opinion. And you can see here relative stability in the way that Americans talked about the Affordable Care Act. So for example, the top left panel shows that people who, in explaining their views, use words like government. They don't want the government to control their healthcare. It's not, should be the private sector. Those kinds of responses were consistently negative towards the Affordable Care Act. Whereas people who emphasize words like access, affordable, those are people who are consistently favorable towards the Affordable Care Act. But through this and a range of other studies, one of the key things that I've seen is that both Americans' attitudes were quite stable, hence the title of the book, and there's very little impact that concerted rhetoric by politicians demonstrably and durably moved healthcare attitudes. So just by way of wrapping up then, what did move healthcare attitudes? Threats to the status quo. In the fall of 2017, I did a survey experiment that I would later replicate, where I either described Republican attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act as attempts to change the existing healthcare status quo, or as attempts to return us to the pre-2010 healthcare status quo. And if you describe repeal efforts as an attempt to return us to the prior status quo, as this figure here shows, you get markedly more support. And so one of the challenges in American politics is that if you're implementing a new program, you are challenging the status quo and you're swimming upstream. Whereas if you're in the position of defending something, maybe something that's been taken away, and we can think about Dobbs here, you're in a much stronger position with respect to public opinion. There you're swimming downstream. So the take-home points I would offer are that in a complex, fragmented political world, political leaders have only limited levers to move public opinion directly. that personal experiences with policymaking alone are unlikely to cement a political coalition. So if you were thinking about how to durably win the support of certain political groups, policy is obviously important to that, but policymaking alone is not necessarily going to cement a political coalition. And I'm excited in the Q&A to talk more about that claim. One of the primary ways to move public opinion is negative, to induce threat, to upend the status quo, and to generate a response. We saw that in the wake of the passage of the Affordable Care Act with the Tea Party elections in 2010 and then again in 2014. And then on the flip side, you could argue that that was part of the dynamic in elections like 2018 and even in 2022. So concrete experiences with policymaking do not shift overall public opinion much. That's not to say that public opinion doesn't move, but that it's moving because even those people who don't have direct experiences with policy are themselves shifting. And since that's in many, many instances a much larger group, that's going to be what drives changes in public opinion. And voters do get high-level accountability, right? Voters liked the Affordable Care Act overall, and the elements of it that they didn't like, things like the individual mandate, were the parts of the Affordable Care Act that have since been repealed. But at the same time, so much policymaking happens at the meso level where voters are unable to pay as much attention. And so I think in summarizing this work, that the image of the public as something like an absentee parent that is mostly just letting the kids fight in another room, and then occasionally comes back to see them fighting and doesn't have the time to disentangle who started it or who took which blocks. That's not a bad metaphor. So I look forward to hearing what Anna has to say and later your questions. Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you. That was really interesting, and I also felt a little PTSD from having lived through all of it in Washington and also in all the campaigns that I worked on. I have just some observations, not really, I think that overall I agree with the conclusion of this research that the data are very compelling, but I also think that we know a lot about how public opinion forms and how it changes over time. And given what a lot of people know about this, what the research suggests, it's not a surprise that national policymaking has a limited impact on public opinion, and that public opinion tends to change slowly over time, tends to be in reaction to things that directly affect people. And for a variety of reasons, ACA actually had an effect on everybody in the United States, but was perceived to have a very small impact on people. I'll talk about that in a second. And also, I think, is a function of culture change. So, for example, if you look at changing attitudes around marriage equality, the policy conversation about that, which was fairly limited, but certainly you had in 2004, for example, referenda, all over the country banning gay marriage, for example. So there was a policy debate happening on the issue, though it wasn't necessarily a national policy debate. But when you really start seeing attitudinal change, really comes from changes in pop culture, where whether it's gay characters in TV shows or in entertainment, and then also the increase in the number of people coming out of the closet, and so that people are having kind of personal and cultural experience, and that sort of leads to changing attitudes around a set of legal rights for LGBTQ plus individuals. And so it's not really the national policy debate, and if anything, national policy and certainly Supreme Court decision making is kind of following public opinion changes versus the other way around. And so, again, an intense and exciting and multi-year national policy debate doesn't necessarily affect public opinion immediately or in a direct way. For all of those reasons, that is not necessarily part of the cultural conversation. It's not part of people's personal experiences. A lot of it is obscure and complicated. And, I would layer on top of that, it's not as extreme as it is now, but we certainly had the beginning of the fragmentation of the media and people curating what media sources they paid attention to. And so that, in many cases, people weren't hearing a kind of, here's what the Democrats say, here what the Republicans say, but hearing, through a very, very biased lens, whether it's from the left or the right. a set of information about the ACA that would make it difficult for different perspectives to come in, and particularly on the right, and sort of make people more favorable towards it. So all of this makes a ton of sense. So let me just make some observations about ACA. And what I think happened. One, I think that notwithstanding the fact that national policy debates tend to not change public opinion in a direct way, it is also the case that I think there was message failure on the part of Democrats. And if going into, the lead up to the ACA, if you talk to people about what their issue was with healthcare, it was affordability, being able to afford their premiums, being able to afford deductibles, copays, et cetera, but also insecure access, because before we had protections for people with pre-existing conditions, people didn't want to leave jobs in case they had some medical condition and they were concerned they were not going to be able to be insured if they changed their jobs. And then certainly people hit lifetime caps with various health conditions. And so you had a kind of sense of insecurity around your attachment to healthcare, that you had to pretty much stay healthy and have no pre-existing conditions in order to have access to healthcare, let alone affordable healthcare. Now, what Obamacare did, or what ACA did, didn't really produce affordable healthcare. It didn't. In fact, there was a provision that was taken out at a certain point that dealt with trying to put caps on the premiums that health insurance insurers could, caps on premiums for insurers, and that was taken out of the final the final language. And so the ACA had no impact on people's health insurance, on the cost of their health insurance. And similarly, because of the resistance, in particular in a lot of states to ACA and other reasons, the exchanges themselves were not that affordable. So there were states where you had only one or two insurers who were willing to participate in the state exchanges. And so the marketplace was actually, in states that decided to have an exchange, it wasn't always super cheap. In so many cases, it was pretty expensive. And then, of course, you had states that refused to set up an exchange at all, and you had to go through the federal system to buy insurance. And so the thing that bothered people, of the two things that bothered people the most, one of them was completely unaddressed by the ACA. You could imagine it might have been a very different situation if somehow the ACA had affected premiums and the cost of health insurance and the cost of healthcare. The thing that what I say is message failure, again, agreeing with the premise that it's very difficult to shift public opinion through policy debates, was that the thing that affected everybody was the pre-existing condition change, right? Which is that you could not cut people off, you could not deny coverage if they had pre-existing conditions. I don't think, if you ask your average voter, why that's the case, I do not think they could tell you that was in the ACA. And the fact that the ACA debate on the Democratic side and the progressive side was very much about universal access, universal coverage, as opposed to secure attachment to healthcare, which is what the pre-existing condition change did, was that people no longer had, and it got rid of lifetime caps, a whole variety, different treatment for men and women, a whole variety of things that had nothing to do with the exchanges, had nothing to do with Medicaid expansion. Not suggesting it would have sort of worked, but it was, in my view, it is a failure that most people don't know that that's where that policy change came from, because I think in terms of status threat, I'm not even sure when repeal went through, was working its way through Congress in 2017, that your average person would have known that repeal meant getting rid of the pre-existing condition. Now, we, of course, for those of us who worked in the 2018 elections, it was sort of the foundation of our campaign, was talking about the Republicans who voted to take away your protection for pre-existing conditions. But at the time that was happening, I would be shocked if anybody knew that would have been a consequence. And so in terms of status threat, I have a feeling that had Obamacare been repealed, if ACA had been repealed, and people and insurance companies were allowed to be capricious again, I think you would have seen a very significant impact on public opinion. I think the second reason why it was very hard for to sort of improve people's attitudes around the ACA is that it very much was wrapped up in a referendum on Obama. I mean, they called it Obamacare, which he embraced, obviously. And so the 2020 election, people blamed the massive losses, especially in the House in 2010, on the passage of ACA. But in fact, I would just say it was overdetermined. I mean, the reaction, in part through like the Tea Party, for example, the reaction to Obama's election was so much driven by racial animus, as was the Tea Party, which ostensibly was around spending and taxes, ultimately was fundamentally about race and was co-opted by national Republicans. And so, the ACA is really, a referendum on Obama in the 2020 election, in my view. I don't believe that, with the exception of potentially the mandate, some people might have known about the mandate. And for many on the right, it was about, there was arguments about Obama was creating a government benefit for Black people so that they would be dependent on the government and therefore cement their attachment to the Democratic Party forever. I don't know if anyone remembers those kinds of arguments that even the kind of ACA, which should be race neutral in a way, right, was wrapped up in arguments about race. And so I think part of the challenge for the ACA was that it was very much intertwined with attitudes about Obama. And as the 2010 election was, I think, a reaction to Obama that was, part of it was the traditional you lose seats in the midterm, but it was also, and he also had, obviously we had the lingering effects of the meltdown in 2008. So, obviously there was economic struggles and that sort of thing, but regardless, ACA becomes part of the overall referendum, on Obama. And then I think that when you look at 2014, you cannot underestimate the rollout problems. And actually, weirdly, I was actually with Governor Dayton in Minnesota the day they rolled it out and the day it failed and would not connect with the Minnesota State Exchange. It was very weird to see it all kind of happen in real time. But, the sense that it wasn't just that, the website failed. It was just the sense that, government, the argument on the right about sort of government takeover, and that government, not only, you're going to lose you can't choose your doctors, and it's kind of communism, and you can't trust the state or the government to do anything well, was kind of just reinforced, right? It was reinforced by the rollout, which went so poorly. The kind of final thing I would say about like why it's so hard to change public opinion around all this stuff is, I think, polarization, political polarization, which has been a feature for many, many years of our political system. But I think, academic researchers would suggest that we've got increased partisan polarization and negative partisanship that has gotten worse over time, particularly with the rise of social media and the fragmentation of the national media. And so, it wasn't as true in 2010 and, in the years of, 9 to 14 when it's being formulated and rolled out. It wasn't as bad as it is now, but it was there, right? And so that, what John Zoller, who wrote a book called The Nature and Origin of Mass Opinion, argued, and there's good critiques of what he's done, but some of it I find very compelling, is that, people don't walk around with preformed opinions about policy issues, but they develop the opinion they express to a pollster based on kind of their political preferences that are kind of inherent. Are you a Democrat, are you a Republican, are you a liberal, conservative, whatever? And then the elite debate, and like what you hear happening in the elite and that, so someone asks you a question and you answer it based on those two things, right? And then obviously for people who are more informed, they have more stability in the opinion they express, versus people who are less informed tend to have more instability because it's a bit more affected by the debate. Well, if you're not exposed to the total elite debate, you're only exposed to Fox, you're only exposed to, I'm trying to think of what the liberal would have been, talking points memo, whenever that started, right? If you're only exposed to certain, and then of course we have people who, we are increasingly polarized in who we live near and who we marry. And so we don't have friends who have different opinions than us. And so if you're only kind of getting one sort of side of it, it's very difficult. There's no three networks all sort of in a fairly straightforward way reporting news and everybody's getting the same information, but people are curating either knowingly or unknowingly kind of what they hear. And so there isn't a big elite debate where you hear all sides and then make a decision. It's not that it really works that way, but it's a very kind of fragmented and siloed sort of process. And so in that sense, it's not that much of a surprise, but I would also that you are really, it's very difficult to kind of move opinion about ACA. And then finally, I would just say that I completely agree about status threat. And I think that's right. I think Dobbs is a really good example of a right that was sort of taken for granted, or more commonly just never thought about day to day by anybody. When it's taken away, you actually see a major shift in public opinion. We already were a kind of moderately pro-choice country since 1972, but you now are closer to 60% of people saying that they would support access to abortion in all or most circumstances. It was more like in the 52-55% range. And so for people who study public opinion, that kind of shift is actually pretty big. Have a 5 or 7 point shift. It's not as big as the shift on gay marriage, but it's a pretty big shift. And moreover, you saw a shift where the left started to care about it more than the right, which had not been true historically on abortion. And so when you have that kind of exogenous shock, if you will, to the system, you can see kind of major shifts in attitudes. And I do believe, I said this before, had Trump been able to repeal ACA and had insurance companies been able to go back to being able to deny people coverage or institute lifetime caps again, I do believe you would have seen, I mean, it's impossible to prove, but I would not have been surprised, I guess I would say, if you would have seen a major change in people's views of the ACA, because that really was ultimately the status quo threat for people, is not having guaranteed access, not so much the affordability issue, but the access issue. So I will stop there and give it to the moderators.
Thanks. I'm wondering, Daniel, what your reactions are to Anna's observations.
Yeah, I thought that was great. And I just wanted to amplify a couple of those points. I think that the point that Obamacare was in, say, 2010, a real vehicle for many Republicans, many Tea Party activists to attack President Obama in part, is really important. Because one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I wanted to try to document many of the lessons about the Affordable Care Act, as they may well be relevant to the Inflation Reduction Act or to a variety of things policy proposals that we may see in the future. But there's a critical difference between the ACA and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is that at the time of the ACA, as Anna, I think, very rightly emphasized, Obamacare was a great vehicle to attack Obama. It even bore his name, right? But at the same time, it let activists who were very concerned about Obama as president join forces with interest groups that were very concerned about increases in marginal tax rates. And they had a common foe in Obamacare and a common language. And so the Republican Party was really very focused on fighting Obamacare. It was the most common theme in Republican advertising in 2010 and in 2014. Now, if you fast forward a decade or more, many of the attacks on Joe Biden are attacks on, you can drive here in Pennsylvania for not too long, back when where our roads worked. You could drive on our highways and you could see, clear expressions of people hate Joe Biden. But they're not linked to the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not that people have bumper stickers that say, negative things about the Inflation Reduction Act. They're just going straight for the person. I think that that's instructive about the evolution of the Republican Party in the last decade, that the intense negative animosity towards key Democrats remains, but it's not directed in a focused, sustained way by groups at a single piece of legislation the way it was. There's a lot in what Anna said that I could emphasize. I would point out that the Affordable Care Act generated a real paradox in that survey after survey showed that most Americans liked most of its features. And so, you can stay on your parents' health insurance until you're 26. Most Americans like that. They ended lifetime caps on insurance, which affected people with severe chronic health issues. Americans like that. There was a implementation of a medical loss ratio. So insurance companies had to spend, I think it was at least 80% of their money on healthcare as opposed to on administration. There were limits on insurance companies' CEO salaries. Americans liked all of that. But what was strange about the Affordable Care Act is that for millions of Americans, their attitudes became synonymous with the least popular element of the bill, which was the individual mandate, until it was removed in late 2017. And that's instructive. And I think that Democrats seem to have learned that lesson, in that the Inflation Reduction Act was much more focused on carrots than on sticks. And I think that one of the critical questions you ask when fashioning a public policy, was the ACA a little bit too technocratic? Did the Democrats spend too much political capital on, at the insistence of economists who reasonably said, hey, you need this individual mandate. But Barack Obama did not support the individual mandate when he was running for president in 2007 and 2008. He was later convinced by many advisors that it would be a valuable part of the policy. And I think that there is a very interesting question about whether the Democrats put too many political chips on the individual mandate relative to other approaches. And the final thing I'll say, though this is obviously a really, really important topic, there's an entire chapter in, and I have the book right here. There's an entire chapter in the book about race and racial attitudes. I've done a range of experiments with different groups of people in different parts of the country where I have reminded them that the Affordable Care Act, to an important extent, benefits Latino and African-American communities. And I've actually found that that doesn't move attitudes in the vast majority of the experiments that I've done. But I do find that more durable, long-standing narratives about who is deserving and who's not deserving of benefits, which are clearly related to Americans' racial attitudes, are an important feature of attitudes towards the Affordable Care Act. And so there's an entire chapter where I write about the ways in which racial attitudes for white Americans may be more of a long-term, it may kind of set the stage more than they actually kind of like speak the lines of this drama.
Patricia, you want to open it up?
Absolutely. So one of the first questions that I wanted to ask of both you, Anna, and you, Dan, it's actually, Anna, something that you alluded to, which is I'm curious if you have an opinion or research about whether the complexity of the policy has an impact, or if it's just a sort of blanket statement that policies don't really drive public opinion.
Well, this is just based on my personal experience, not on academic research, but I'm sure that Dan can respond to it. But certainly it is my experience that the more complex a policy is, the harder it is to, first of all, most people don't pay very close attention to politics to begin with, right? And if they do, it tends to be more local than national, and people tend to not make real connections with what happens in Washington to their daily lives, even if, and in part that's because a lot of the implementation of policy does happen, through the states. So just in general, complex national policy making is a fairly remote activity for most people. They don't pay very much attention to. So obviously, the more complex, the more technocratic, the harder it is to explain to people, particularly when you have, again, this fragmentation of the media. You don't have, the bully pulpit is much weaker than it used to be. And you have this kind of fragmentation of the media where people are, in kind of information silos. It's one of the bigger challenges that I face as a pollster working with people running for office, is trying to take things that are complex and make them simple for people to talk about them. And that's why I go back to, again, I'm not suggesting that had Democrats talked about pre-X the entire time that things would be different, but it certainly was the most understandable and the piece of the ACA that had the most impact on the most number of people. And it's pretty easy to understand, to saying it prevents insurance companies from denying you coverage because you have a medical condition. And if it makes me wonder if that's all we'd said over and over and over and over again. But it says like state exchanges and the gold plan and the silver and the bronze plan and the mandate, like it was a lot in that legislation, and it was, I think, really hard for people to understand how it was going to work.
Definitely. Thanks, Anna. Dan, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I would build on Anna's response by just saying that I think one of the challenges is that American society, as Anna's remarks had reminded us, highly complex. Our media market is fragmented. And so I think that one of the jobs of people who are in different political communication roles is to really be attentive to who they're communicating with. Sometimes my impression is that many of us think that we're speaking directly to swing voters. Swing voters are off, they're paying attention to the Phillies or the Eagles, or maybe even not a Philadelphia sports team, heaven forbid. And they don't have a ton of time, and they're often not the audience. So I think we need to have a really differentiated notion of, is this communication that's primarily for technocrats? Am I trying to convince Ezra Klein? Am I trying to convince insurance companies? Am I trying to convince voters? And so I think having a more differentiated notion of how complex our political world is really, really important. And I think it's one of the tasks that political scientists too can contribute to in helping segment audiences. And I think the one other thing I'll say about complexity is that there's there's a trade-off here. One of the core reasons the ACA is complex is because it had to get through the House and the Senate. It had to win 60 votes in the Senate. Then the Supreme Court got its say. And to build a law, given the existing complexity of our healthcare system, that key stakeholders, that would at least get some buy-in from pharma, from insurance companies, the ACA was necessarily going to be complex. And then that was going to just open up so many avenues for attack. And so I think that, yes, would a less complex version of the ACA been more defendable? Yes, but it would never have passed the Senate in the first place. And that the complexity that allowed it to get 60 votes in the United States Senate, including from like real moderates like Ben Nelson, was precisely then going to be a challenge when it came to implementation and in the face of sustained Republican attacks on the law.
Thank you both. That just inspires more super nerdy and wonky political science questions from me, but it's not about me. It's about our audience today. So I'm going to take it to our top question, which is from Kim Haddow. Kim's asking, does the fact that states have been slowly moving to expand Medicaid reflect a change in public opinion based on the efficacy of Obamacare?
I don't think so. I think it's in of itself, it's just popular. And in states where they've been able to put it on the ballot, it's passed because it's popular. And that's how you get it in these red states where the legislature wouldn't do it. And Medicaid is a popular program. People tend to assume that it's not as popular as Medicare, but it's not far behind. And people tend to assume that Medicaid's not popular because it's, in part, an insurance program for low income people and is targeted. It's not universal, though people forget that like everybody's grandmother is in a nursing home paid for by Medicaid. So Medicaid's actually pretty popular. So, I sort of view this as it's a popular program and people want to expand it. And so when you can get it on the ballot in these red states, it passes. That's my gut answer to that.
Yeah, and certainly we've seen even, so Maine in 2017 was one of the earlier states to put it on the ballot. It passed there by a wide margin, even after Hillary Clinton only very narrowly won Maine. So there's a sizable number of voters. And when I've looked at in the book, I look at Oklahoma, I look at Maine, and yeah, Medicaid as a policy is popular. I think that those of us who remember the 1980s and the 1990s we may have a strong sense that the politics of welfare, of social welfare programs, of means-tested benefits is necessarily one that disadvantages Democrats. We may remember a lot of the racialized talk about welfare queens and Bill Clinton, a Democrat, promising to end welfare as we knew it in the 1990s. And my look at Medicaid attitudes more recently, very consistent with what Anna had just said, is that the Medicaid politics of the 2010s or contemporary Medicaid politics is very different than that racialized majoritarian politics of the 1980s and 1990s.
Thank you. One of the continuing themes of these PSG webinars is actually about messaging. And so there's a question here from Nancy Zadunkowitz. Nancy, thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to invite you both, Dan and Anna, to build on this question as it relates to messaging and how that might impact public opinion. Can you speak to the difference in support in polling when tested as the Affordable Care Act versus Obamacare? And what lessons might there be there for future policy debates, discussions?
I'm happy to jump in first. So the testing that I've done suggests that actually there's not that wide a gap. Now, this would depend when you did the testing, but I, in surveys in 2017 and 2018, asked people about Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act. And I didn't actually find that much by way of a difference at that time, because by then the ACA had been salient for years. And I think people's attitudes were genuinely stable and reflecting the sum of all of the things that they had heard for a long time. So I didn't see that much of a differentiation when I looked at it in survey experiments in 2017 and 2018. But that is to say, I think Anna's point earlier was a really important one, that in the early period, Obamacare gave Republicans a ostensibly race-neutral avenue through which to Hillary, then President Obama. And I think that is an important element of what's going on.
Yep, I agree with all that. We did split sample where we do Obamacare versus ACA and not get much difference, to the point where eventually we just started saying ACA, also known as Obamacare, just to make sure we really were capturing what people thought about it. So
Wonderful. Thanks. Paige, do you want to jump in before I continue with some more questions from the audience?
I just have a question about changing public attitudes. And it seems to me one of the central arguments is it's about loss aversion and losing a benefit as opposed to gaining something when it's at the front end. One of the things that I'm curious about is the sense of loss aversion different when you have a passive benefit like the child tax credit. And, you know, when that got taken away, is the feeling of loss greater than something, you know, another kind of policy?
I'm certainly happy to speak to that initially. And I think one of the real surprises of the child tax credit is that here was a substantial benefit that was given to people and then was removed without a ton of fanfare. And I think that reflects a number of things. I think partly the organizational life of American politics and the American left has really changed. Unions play a different role in the Democratic coalition than they previously did, and the unions that are the strongest politically are different unions, right? They may be more likely to be public sector unions, and I think that what all that means is that if you have a benefit that is provided through the tax code and may not be highly salient, and if there aren't key groups that have connections, durable connections to groups of voters, I think it is easier in that case to repeal that benefit. But that if you have groups or candidates who really are emphasizing a certain kind of benefit, and if it's provided, say, more directly, those are the kinds of policies that I think are particularly likely to give rise to the status quo bias, the loss aversion that I saw with the Affordable Care Act.
I agree with that. I also think in particular, this implementation of it, because it was done through the auspices of stimulus and COVID response, it felt like a kind of a temporary program to get through a challenging period as opposed to a fundamental policy change. And so I think for many people, especially because many people got the child tax credit, didn't quote unquote need it. So that when it went away, it wasn't that much of a loss. I had people in focus groups saying, yeah, I used it to go out to dinner, you know, right? I mean, for people who are middle income or higher income who got it, they didn't really need it, right? And so, you know, when it went away, it was like, oh yeah, that stimulus program went away. There wasn't, to Dan's point, there wasn't like a robust national conversation about family policy and how we support families, and this is the pillar of it. And then again, it was kind of like shoved in a package of other forms of relief that also went away, like expanded unemployment benefits and that kind of thing.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
There are a couple, but we've mostly addressed them in other ways. So I think I'll leave it be for now.
I do have one question. There are some policies that create an immediate sea change in American politics. And it's sort of like, if you think about the Voting Rights Act and things like that. And but there's so few examples of those. And I'm wondering why, I mean, in some ways you can say the ACA did in terms of the reaction to the Tea Party, but there are so few examples of this in American politics. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
I think I'd be super curious to hear Anna's views on this. I think partly that American society nowadays is highly, highly complex, right? If you think about the New Deal, the time of the New Deal, the American economy was a more straightforward economy where there were fewer different kinds of jobs. And so some of these policies were understandably a bit less complicated. They had to be to administer them given the tools that they had at the time. And I think that that the Voting Rights Act understandably changed our politics, partly because it was targeted at doing so, right? It was targeted at protecting the right to vote for millions of people who had been disenfranchised through a variety of levers. I think that in researching and writing this book, one of the core conclusions that I've come to is that in this polarized moment, we all too often evaluate policies based on their ostensible political benefits. And I think that sometimes gets things backwards. I think that we try to win in politics so that we can enact effective policies, but effective policies are not always going to bring immediate political benefits. And so if you think about the 2020 Democratic primary, there was a lot of argument about the political impacts of different policies. And I think at a polarized time, it makes sense that politicians are trying to sell themselves as people who can break through this really painful logjam where, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans are relatively evenly matched. But one of my arguments from the book is, given that the public isn't paying close attention to, you know, the public is a little bit like an audience for much of the performance is out in the hallway and occasionally kind of peeks in, sees what's going on, and then goes back out into the lobby. And so given that, I think we should really be focused on getting the policy right and less trying to make elaborate claims that our policy is going to be the one that transforms American politics. We should try to win in American politics so that we can enact good policies, if that makes sense.
I agree with all that. And I think the times in our history when we've been able to make major policy change that has a major impact on people is often in response to crisis or some kind of shock to the system. So obviously Social Security and Medicare is a reaction to, you know, especially Social Security, the New Deal is a reaction to the Depression. You know, a lot of surveillance policies is a reaction to 9/11. So that a lot of times when we get big impactful policy change, something happens, right? And there is a reaction, a political and policy reaction to it. And unfortunately, you know, for better or worse, you can't really predict when those things are gonna happen. But that's often when we get massive change in policy and in ways that actually people understand and how it affects them is when it's a response to a crisis.
Great. Thank you, guys. This is really an interesting conversation. Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Patricia.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
That's it. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you next month. And we've got the link in the chat. Dan, Anna, terrific conversation. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Have a great day,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
So much.
Bye.